In the frozen valleys of 8th century Scandinavia, the rhythmic hammering of iron against anvil creates a symphony that will echo across 4 centuries of European history. Master smiths work through endless winter nights, transforming bog iron pulled from murky swamps into gleaming instruments of war. These craftsmen guard their secrets jealously, the precise temperature that turns brittle iron into flexible steel, the sacred words chanted while quenching red-hot blades in whale oil, the perfect balance between hardness and flexibility that prevents a sword from shattering against shield rims. But here's what the records don't tell us. How did these northern smiths discover the exact proportions of carbon needed to transform soft iron into deadly steel? The sagas speak of master craftsmen who sang to the metal and read the colors of fire, yet the technical manuscripts that might explain their methods vanished centuries ago. What we know comes from the weapons themselves, archaeological evidence of metallurgical sophistication that rivals anything produced in the Christian kingdoms to the south. The transformation begins not with warriors, but with farmers, whose agricultural tools become the templates for devastating weapons. The same bearded axe that clears forests for new settlements will soon cleave through monastery doors. The knife every farmhand carries to cut rope and prepare meals evolves into the CX, a blade that will rest against 10,000 Viking hips. The hunting spear that feeds families through harsh winters becomes the primary weapon that 9 out of 10 Viking warriors will carry into battle. This evolution from tool to weapon reflects a fundamental shift in Scandinavian society as population pressure builds and arable land becomes scarce. Young men look across the North Sea for opportunities their fathers never imagined. The first true Viking weapons emerge around 790 after Christ, coinciding with improved shipbuilding techniques that make long-distance raiding possible. In hidden forges from Trondheim to Uppsala, smiths begin producing specialized war gear. They import crucible steel from Central Asia through Russian river routes, paying fortunes in furs and amber for small ingots that will become the cores of legendary swords. The most skilled smiths learn pattern welding, twisting different grades of steel together like rope, creating blades with mesmerizing serpentine patterns that seem to writhe in firelight. These Ulfbert swords, marked with the mysterious smith's name, become so valuable that a single blade costs 30 milk cows, enough wealth to establish a small farm. Yet the Ulfbert inscription itself presents a riddle that historians still debate. Over 170 swords bearing this mark have been discovered across Europe, spanning nearly 2 centuries of production. Was Ulfbert a single master smith whose workshop continued after his death? A guild mark? A brand name counterfeited by ambitious craftsmen? The consistency of quality across these blades suggests rigorous standards, but the geographic spread from Norway to Ukraine, from Ireland to Russia, hints at something larger than a single forge. Modern metallurgical analysis deepens the mystery. These swords contain steel with remarkably low slag content, requiring temperatures and techniques that shouldn't exist in 8th century Europe. Some researchers suggest the steel came from crucibles in distant Persia or India, while others argue for lost northern techniques that died with their practitioners. The truth remains locked in the molecular structure of blades pulled from river bottoms and burial mounds. Women play a crucial but overlooked role in this weapons culture. Wealthy wives commission elaborate weapons as gifts for their husbands, their names sometimes appearing in runic inscriptions alongside the smith's mark. The saga of Laxdæla tells of Gudrun, who presents her son with a sword she inherited from her father, creating a lineage of violence passed through female hands. Meanwhile, Volva's female shamans perform rituals over newly forged blades, calling upon Thor's strength and Odin's cunning to inhabit the metal. Young girls learn to maintain their fathers' and brothers' weapons, understanding that a well-oiled blade might mean the difference between widowhood and reunion. The spiritual dimension of weapon-making goes deeper than Christian chroniclers cared to record. Smiths worked under the protection of dwarven powers, those subterranean beings the Norse believed first taught men to work metal. Some forges were built over natural springs, the water used for quenching considered sacred. Others incorporated small amounts of meteoric iron sky metal, believed to carry the power of the gods themselves. When a weapon failed in battle or a blade cracked during forging, smiths didn't simply discard the material. They held rituals, returning the iron to the earth, apologizing to the spirits they believed inhabited it. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribe in Denmark reveals the scale of this early weapons industry. Excavations uncovered thousands of pieces of smithing debris slag, broken tools, failed blade fragments. Chemical analysis shows iron coming from multiple sources: local bog iron, imported ingots from Sweden's Norberg region, and rare crucible steel from Central Asia. The logistics required to gather these materials, transform them into weapons, and distribute them across Scandinavia suggest organizational complexity that challenges our understanding of barbaric Norse society. By 800 after Christ, weapon production had become industrialized by medieval standards. A single large forge could produce dozens of spearheads weekly, hundreds monthly. The demand seemed insatiable. Every free man required weapons, not just for raiding but for defense, hunting, and displaying status. The poorest farmer needed at least a spear and CX. A carl, a free landowner, required a shield, spear, axe, and possibly a sword. A jarl, a chieftain, outfitted his entire retinue, sometimes dozens of warriors, ensuring their loyalty through gifts of deadly steel. But here's what troubles modern historians. The archaeological record shows far more weapons than the population could reasonably use. Some burial sites contain 10 or 15 swords per grave, scores of spearheads, multiple axes. Were these ceremonial displays of wealth, insurance for the afterlife's battles, or evidence of something we don't yet understand about Viking death rituals and beliefs about the journey beyond? The winter forges of Scandinavia transformed more than iron into steel. They transformed a farming society into a military culture, wooden tools into instruments of conquest, local craftsmen into artists whose work would be treasured across continents. In those long northern nights, as sparks rose toward dark skies and hammers rang against anvils, something fundamental shifted. The age of the Vikings wasn't born in the moment longships first touched foreign shores. It was born in the fire and smoke of those early forges, where iron learned to sing songs of blood and glory. The complete Viking arsenal tells a story of practical adaptation and deadly efficiency. As longships slide down log rollers into dark northern waters, each warrior's loadout reflects careful calculation. The average raider carries between 15 and 20 pounds of weapons, enough to fight effectively, but not so much that it hinders rowing or quick beach landings. At his hip hangs the CX, a single-edged knife ranging from 6 to 24 inches, serving as tool, eating utensil, and last resort weapon. The wealthy wear elaborate CXs with carved antler handles and silver inlaid sheaths, while poor farmers make do with simple iron blades and leather wrappings. But here's what the burial evidence reveals. Distinction between tool and weapon blurs in ways that suggest Vikings thought differently about violence than we do. A CX excavated from a Norwegian farmstead shows wear patterns from cutting rope, preparing food, and carving wood. Yet its edge bears the distinctive notching that comes only from striking bone. The same blade fed children and killed men, without ceremony or distinction. The spear dominates Viking warfare through sheer practicality. A skilled smith can forge 5 spearheads in the time it takes to create one sword, making them affordable for every free man. Viking spears come in dozens of varieties: light throwing spears called gear that warriors hurl in opening volleys, heavy thrusting spears for shield wall combat, and specialized boar spears with crossbars to prevent overpenetration. Warriors name their favorite spears like old friends: leg biter, shield splitter, wound maker. The most prized spears feature pattern-welded heads that shimmer like water, with wings or lugs that catch enemy weapons and create openings for lethal thrusts. Archaeological analysis of spearheads from battle sites tells a darker story. Many show evidence of repeated sharpening, the blades worn down from their original length by half or more. These weren't ceremonial weapons retired after single battles. They were working tools of violence, used again and again until the metal could no longer hold an edge. One spearhead from a Swedish warrior's grave had been resharpened so many times that it resembled a needle more than a blade. Yet the warrior was buried with it, suggesting deep emotional attachment to a weapon that had served him well. The mystery deepens when we examine throwing spears. The sagas describe warriors hurling multiple spears in rapid succession, yet the physics don't quite align with surviving examples. A properly balanced throwing spear needs to be lighter than excavated specimens suggest. Either the sagas exaggerate the throwing, distances and frequencies, or Vikings possessed techniques for spear throwing that modern experimental archaeologists haven't yet reconstructed. Some researchers suggest specialized throwing weights or grips that haven't survived in the archaeological record, but this remains speculation built on silence. The Viking axe evolves from humble beginnings into the most feared weapon in northern Europe. Early Vikings carry small hand axes, barely different from woodcutting tools, but by 900 after Christ, specialized battle axes emerge that terrify European defenders. The broad axe features a beard-like extension that hooks over shield edges, yanking them down to expose enemy necks. The Danish axe, wielded two-handed by elite warriors called huskarls, stretches 5 feet long with a cutting edge spanning 12 inches. These massive weapons require years of training but can split shields, shatter swords, and cleave through mail armor as if it were cloth. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological impact of facing Danish axes. A Frankish monk at Tours writes of raiders whose axes sang through the air like wind before thunder, while an Anglo-Saxon chronicler describes huskarls who could cleave a horse from head to saddle. Modern testing with reconstructed axes suggests these accounts aren't mere exaggeration. A skilled axeman generating proper momentum could indeed deliver strikes of devastating power. Yet here's what troubles weapons historians. The engineering of Danish axes seems almost impossibly sophisticated. The cutting edge must be harder than the rest of the head to hold sharpness, but the socket that fits over the haft must be softer to absorb shock without cracking. This requires differential heat treatment, heating different parts of the same piece to different temperatures, a technique that shouldn't be widespread in 10th century Scandinavia. Either Viking smiths possessed more advanced knowledge than we've credited them with, or they stumbled upon effective techniques through trial and error without understanding the metallurgical principles involved. We may never know which. Swords remain the aristocratic weapon, carried by perhaps one warrior in 10. Beyond their practical value, swords carry profound social meaning. They pass from father to son across generations, accumulating names and histories. Brynjubit, a male biter, serves 3 generations of Norwegian jarls. Gramfierce allegedly belongs to the legendary Sigurd the Dragonslayer. These blades receive the same funeral rites as warriors, wrapped in fine cloth, laid in specially constructed chambers, sometimes deliberately killed by bending to accompany their owners to Valhalla. The practice of sword bending presents its own enigma. Why destroy valuable weapons worth years of labor? Some archaeologists suggest purely ritual motives, ensuring the sword serves only its master in the afterlife. Others propose more practical explanations, preventing grave robbery by making the sword useless to thieves. But bent swords appear in contexts where other valuable grave goods remain intact and functional, suggesting the practice held meanings we've lost. DNA analysis of leather sword grips reveals another mystery. Many show traces of human skin oils from multiple individuals, suggesting swords passed between warriors more frequently than inheritance patterns would suggest. Were these weapons loaned between brothers, borrowed for raids, or captured and reused by victorious enemies? The molecular evidence opens questions the sagas never thought to answer. The bow occupies an ambiguous position in Viking culture. While every warrior learns archery for hunting, many consider it less honorable than face-to-face combat. Still, Viking archers prove devastatingly effective, particularly in sea battles where arrows rain down on enemy ships. Viking bows, crafted from yew or elm, pull at 70 to 90 pounds, powerful enough to penetrate mail at close range. Some warriors gain fame as master archers, like Einar Tambar Skelver, whose bow, Tambar, sings so loudly when drawn that enemies flee at its sound. But here's what the bone evidence reveals. Viking skeletons show surprisingly few arrow wounds compared to blade trauma. Either Viking archers were remarkably accurate at hitting fatal spots that left no skeletal trace, or archery played a smaller role in actual combat than the sagas suggest. The disconnect between literary sources and physical evidence hints at biases in what gets remembered and recorded. Perhaps dying by arrow lacked the glory necessary for saga immortality. The strangest weapons appear only in grave contexts, never mentioned in written sources. Excavations have uncovered bladed chains, hooked throwing weights, and multi-pronged spears whose purposes remain mysterious. Were these experimental weapons that failed in practice? Ceremonial objects never meant for combat? Or specialized tools for types of warfare the written record doesn't preserve? Each unexplained artifact reminds us how much we've forgotten about Viking military culture. As longships returned from foreign shores, they brought back not just plunder but weapons technology. Frankish swords, Arab daggers, Byzantine spears all appear in Scandinavian graves, sometimes modified with Norse fittings, sometimes preserved in their original form as exotic trophies. This cultural exchange created hybrid weapons that defy simple classification, blades that belong to no single tradition but emerge from the violent meeting of civilizations. The arsenal that crossed dark waters transformed the medieval world, but it also transformed those who carried it. Each weapon bore not just its maker's mark, but the psychic weight of accumulated violence, the memory of every life it had taken. In a culture that believed objects possessed spirits, that swords could hunger for blood, and axes could remember their kills, the distinction between warrior and weapon began to blur. The blade became an extension of the man, and the man became, in some sense, an instrument of the blade's will. Between 850 and 1000 after Christ, Viking weapons reached their technological and tactical peak. The small raiding parties of earlier generations transform into massive armies. The great heathen army that invades England numbers over 3,000 warriors, while Knut's invasion force of 1016 includes more than 10,000 armed men. This shift from raid to conquest demands new approaches to weapons and warfare. Standardization becomes essential for these larger forces. Where earlier Vikings fought as individuals, the great armies fight as coordinated units. Shield walls require uniform spear lengths, typically 8 to 10 feet, so that multiple ranks can present a hedgehog of points to charging enemies. Axes must balance similarly, so warriors can maintain rhythm during the terrifying advance that Vikings call svinfylking or swine array, where wedge formations crash through enemy lines like wild boars through undergrowth. But here's what the mass grave evidence reveals. Standardization remained incomplete, perhaps deliberately so. A burial pit from a 9th century battle in England contains the remains of 63 warriors alongside their weapons. The spear lengths vary by as much as 3 feet. Shield bosses show 15 different manufacturing styles. Even within this supposedly coordinated army, individual preference and regional tradition trumped tactical uniformity. Either Viking commanders tolerated more variation than we'd expect, or the concept of standardized military equipment hadn't fully taken root in Norse culture. The economics of arming thousands of warriors drives innovation. Kings establish royal workshops where smiths mass-produce weapons to standard patterns. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason maintains an arsenal of 2,000 spears and 500 axes at Trondheim, ready to arm levied farmers for his campaigns. Danish kings at Jelling control iron production across Jutland, ensuring steady weapon supplies for their expanding realm. Swedish kings at Uppsala develop trade networks stretching to Constantinople, exchanging furs and slaves for high-quality steel and advanced weapon designs. Yet the administrative records that would illuminate these royal arsenals have vanished almost entirely. We know such warehouses existed from scattered references in sagas and chronicles, but we don't know how they were organized, who controlled access, or how weapons were distributed. A single fragment from an Icelandic manuscript mentions a weapon keeper at a Norwegian court who maintained detailed inventories, but the inventories themselves are lost. What secrets did they contain about the logistics of Viking warfare? How did kings track thousands of weapons across years of campaigning? The silence in the sources feels almost deliberate, as if this knowledge was considered too sensitive to commit to permanent record. Viking weapons spread across the known world through conquest, trade, and mercenary service. Varangian guards carry Danish axes through the streets of Constantinople, inspiring Byzantine military reforms. Irish warriors adopt Viking sword designs, creating distinctive ring-hilted blades that blend Celtic and Norse traditions. French blacksmiths' study captured Viking spears, incorporating their superior welding techniques into Frankish weapon production. The Vikings themselves eagerly adopt foreign innovations. Frankish sword blades re-hilted with Norse fittings, Arab steel forged into Scandinavian patterns, English CX designs modified for Viking tastes. The cross-cultural exchange creates weapons that defy easy categorization. A sword found in a Norwegian chieftain's grave features a Frankish blade, Byzantine gold inlay on the pommel, Irish wirework on the grip, and runic inscriptions in Old Norse. Is this a Viking weapon? A Frankish weapon owned by a Viking? Or something entirely new born from the collision of cultures? Modern museums classify it as Viking based on its burial context, but this label obscures more than it reveals about the cosmopolitan nature of Norse military culture. Individual weapons achieve legendary status during this period. Harald Hardrada's axe, so large he wields it two-handed from horseback, cleaves through enemy warriors, like a knife through butter, according to saga accounts. The sword, Skofnung, belonging to the Danish king Hrolf Kraki, supposedly contains the souls of 12 berserker bodyguards, screaming when drawn for battle. Earl Sigurd's raven banner, while not technically a weapon, terrifies enemies who believe it guarantees victory for the army but death for the standard-bearer. But here's what troubles modern historians. Many legendary weapons appear in multiple contradictory accounts, owned by different warriors in different centuries, performing impossible feats. Skofnung appears in at least 5 separate sagas, attributed to 3 different kings, and described with varying characteristics. Either the same named sword passed through more hands than any source explicitly states, or Skofnung became a generic term for exceptional blades, or later saga writers confused multiple weapons. The legendary weapon becomes a kind of ghostly presence in Norse culture, simultaneously real and mythical, historical and invented. The berserkers represent the psychological dimension of Viking weapons culture. These elite warriors, devoted to Odin, work themselves into trances through ritual drinking, chanting, and possibly consuming psychoactive mushrooms. They bite their shield rims, howl like wolves, and fight with superhuman strength and apparent immunity to pain. Their weapons, usually massive two-handed axes or clubs, become extensions of their fury. Enemies describe berserkers continuing to fight after receiving mortal wounds, their weapons still swinging as they die on their feet. Contemporary medical analysis suggests possible explanations for berserker behavior. Self-induced hyperventilation can produce trance states and temporary pain resistance. Adrenaline from pre-battle rituals might account for extraordinary strength. Some researchers have proposed genetic factors. Hysterical strength runs in families, and berserker status was often hereditary. Yet none of these explanations fully captures what the sources describe. Warriors who seemed to transcend normal human limitations, who fought with a ferocity that terrified even other Vikings. The question that haunts researchers: did berserkers actually exist as described, or were they exaggerated by Christian writers eager to portray pagans as demon-possessed savages? The archaeological record offers ambiguous evidence. Some warrior graves contain massive weapons seemingly too heavy for practical use, suggesting ceremonial display rather than battlefield reality. Other graves show skeletal trauma consistent with warriors who fought through terrible injuries, fractured skulls that healed, broken bones that set improperly yet bore the owner through more battles. The physical evidence suggests something unusual happened, even if we can't fully explain what. Weapon technology during this period also incorporates mysterious innovations. Some spearheads show deliberate asymmetry, with one edge longer than the other, creating a curved flight path when thrown. This should make them less accurate, yet they appear in wealthy warriors' graves, suggesting prestige value. Were these weapons of master throwers who understood aerodynamics intuitively, failed experiments kept for their craftsmanship, or specialized weapons for specific tactical situations we no longer understand? The great armies also develop psychological weapons beyond physical steel. Warriors paint their shields with terrifying, Images, serpents, wolves, ravens meant to unnerve enemies before combat begins. They develop war cries and chants designed to overwhelm opponents' courage. The clashing of weapons on shields before battle, the shield beating, creates thunderous noise meant to sound like the approach of giants or gods. These sonic and visual elements of warfare rarely appear in modern military histories, yet contemporary accounts suggest they were crucial to Viking tactical success. By the year 1000, Viking armies had evolved from loose confederations of raiders into sophisticated military organizations. Yet this sophistication came with a cost, the loss of flexibility and spontaneity that made earlier Vikings so effective. As warfare became more organized, it also became more predictable, more vulnerable to the defensive innovations of their enemies. The thunder of the great armies would soon fade, replaced by the whisper of obsolescence. The end comes swiftly. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, perhaps the greatest Viking warrior ever to live, falls at Stamford Bridge with an arrow through his throat, his famous axe dropping from lifeless hands into Yorkshire mud. 3 weeks later at Hastings, Danish axes wielded by English huscarls fail to stop Norman cavalry. Vikings defeated by descendants of Vikings who adapted to new military realities. The age of Viking weapons enters its twilight, not through any single catastrophic defeat, but through gradual obsolescence. Stone castles render traditional Viking raiding tactics useless. The hit-and-run attacks that terrorized Europe for 3 centuries cannot breach walls 40 feet high and 10 feet thick. Siege warfare requires specialized equipment, catapults, rams, towers that cannot be carried on longships. The spontaneous violence that made Vikings fearsome becomes a liability in prolonged sieges, requiring patience, engineering, and massive logistics. But here's what the castle records reveal. Vikings adapted faster than their enemies expected. By the early 11th century, Norse leaders hire siege engineers from Byzantium and the Islamic world. Danish kings at Dublin construct siege towers using techniques imported from North Africa. Swedish raiders in the Baltic learn to undermine stone foundations. Yet these adaptations appear in fragments of chronicles and letters, never codified into systematic knowledge. The expertise died with individual commanders, never becoming part of Norse military tradition the way it did in other European cultures. Christianity transforms the spiritual relationship between warriors and weapons. The old practice of naming swords and believing they contain spirits becomes heretical. Weapons blessed by Thor must be reconsecrated to Christ or destroyed. Many warriors, converting in old age, break their swords on church altars or throw them into rivers, renouncing their violent past. The magnificent weapons buried with pagan warriors for their journey to Valhalla now go to churches as donations, melted down to create crosses and reliquaries. The archaeological evidence of this transformation tells a poignant story. River deposits from the 11th and 12th centuries contain dozens of deliberately discarded weapons, swords bent beyond repair, spearheads with their sockets smashed, axes with broken hafts. These weren't weapons lost in battle or broken through use. They were ceremonially destroyed, offered to the waters or the earth as acts of renunciation. Each bent blade represents a warrior turning away from the old gods, from the culture that defined him, from the violence that gave his life meaning. Yet, Viking weapon traditions persist in transformed ways. Norman knights carry long swords descended from Viking designs. The English bill, dominant on medieval battlefields for centuries, evolves from the Danish axe. Scottish claymores show clear Viking influence in their construction. Even as late as the 1400s, Scandinavian armies, field soldiers carrying two-handed axes virtually identical to those their Viking ancestors wielded 5 centuries earlier. Here's what the genealogies of weapons reveal. The transition from Viking to medieval European warfare wasn't a clean break, but a gradual blending. A sword made in 1100 might have a blade forged using Viking pattern welding techniques, a crossguard in the new Norman style, and a pommel featuring Christian iconography. The weapon embodies cultural transformation simultaneously. Viking and not Viking, pagan memory wrapped in Christian present. Modern archaeology reveals the true legacy of Viking weapons. The Mummen axe, discovered in a Danish grave, shows inlay work of gold and silver so intricate it rivals jewelry. Swords pulled from river offerings display pattern welding techniques that modern smiths struggle to replicate. Each excavated weapon tells personal stories, the nick in a sword edge from a desperate parry, the worn groove in an axe handle from a warrior's grip, the owner's mark scratched into a spearhead. But here's what troubles archaeologists. We've likely found less than 1% of Viking weapons that once existed. Thousands upon thousands of blades corroded into rust, melted down for reuse, or remain buried in locations we'll never excavate. Each surviving weapon is an anomaly preserved by accident of burial conditions, by the sanctity of grave goods, by chance deposition in oxygen-free water. The weapons we study aren't representative samples, but survivors of selective processes we barely understand. The mystery deepens when we consider what hasn't been found. The sagas describe weapons of legendary quality: the sword, turfing that never missed its mark; the spear Gungnir that always returned to its thrower; the axe that could split mountains. If these were real weapons rather than pure myth, they presumably had distinctive features that would survive in the archaeological record. Yet, we've never found anything matching their descriptions. Either they never existed, or they were so valuable that they were melted down rather than buried, or they remain hidden in graves we haven't discovered. The absence of legendary weapons feels like a hole in history, a gap where something important should be. Today, Viking weapons inspire both serious historical study and popular imagination. Museums from Stockholm to Dublin display these artifacts as national treasures. Traditional smiths in Norway and Iceland maintain ancient forging techniques, creating museum replicas and teaching new generations skills nearly lost to time. Experimental archaeologists test reconstructed weapons to understand their capabilities and limitations. Each new study reveals details the original makers would have known intimately but never thought to record. The final irony: Viking weapons achieved immortality their makers never imagined. The warriors who named their swords and believed them possessed by spirits couldn't have foreseen that their blades would endure 1,000 years. Studied by scholars, displayed in climate-controlled cases, analyzed by technologies that would seem like magic. The weapons outlived their masters, outlived the culture that created them, outlived the gods they were consecrated to serve. These instruments of terror and conquest now serve as bridges to understanding a complex civilization that shaped the modern world. They remind us that history's darkest chapters, the raids, the violence, the centuries of fear, were created by human hands wielding human-made tools. There was nothing supernatural about Viking success, nothing mystical beyond exceptional craftsmanship and brutal efficiency. Yet something in these weapons still speaks across the centuries. Stand before a Viking sword in a museum. Notice how the pattern-welded steel still catches light after 1,000 years. See the careful balance that made it deadly in skilled hands. Read the runes scratched into the blade by someone who believed this weapon would carry him to the afterlife. In that moment, the distance between past and present narrows. The weapon becomes not just an artifact, but a messenger from the darkness, carrying secrets from those who walked in shadows. In the end, Viking weapons prove more enduring than the warriors who wielded them, their steel outlasting flesh, their stories outliving their makers, their mysteries deepening with each passing century. The iron that once sang in northern valleys has fallen silent, but its echoes still reverberate through history, reminding us that some questions have no answers, some secrets remain locked in rust and earth, and some shadows never fully lift.